All right, Darrel. Purity culture is certainly not a new idea for this show, as you of
Yeah.
all well know. But what are we referring to when we use that term?
Well, it's generally related to patriarchal religions of all kinds. It's not new to Christianity, but it's a philosophy, if you will, or an approach to sexuality that basically puts ownership of the sexuality of another human being in the hands of their parents. And it's done to both men and women in the Christian purity culture. But we could actually say that Islam has a deep purity culture, as does Hinduism have a deep purity culture. It's just that within Christianity, they've invented it or reinvented it in a pretty severe way recently. Now, if you go back to 1800s, there was a big purity culture. A woman, if a woman had sex before marriage, she had ruined her whole life pretty much, or got pregnant out of wedlock, she was ruined for life. And that was a sign of purity culture. And that's what we're seeing here today. This notion that if you have sex that's not ordained specifically by your religion and in the way of your religion, then you are somehow damaged pretty much for the rest of your life. Anyway, that's my quick summary of it. I think it goes far more than Christianity, but we're talking today mainly about Christianity, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. This is a pretty wide and history encapsulating idea in a lot of ways. But when would you say that the modern American purity culture movement began?
Well, I can say with a straight face almost that it didn't start in my day.
Sure.
I was having sex when I was 18. I had my first sexual experience with a 18. I was the religious one, and she was not. And she was very interested in helping me get over my.
Delilah led you astray,
and I'm so happy she did. But I felt so damn guilty about it afterwards, because even though it was before the purity culture, I did know that sex before marriage was supposedly wrong, although everybody else was doing it. I was, I'm a 70-year-old, so I'm hip. I'm a hippie. I'm literally a hippie. So even though I don't have the long hair that you do, I
right. Yeah. I've reclaimed that.
Yeah. I was looking at some photographs of me for a project I was doing when I was 21 years old, and I had a Beatles haircut, and all my hair, you wouldn't believe it, but I had hair. And it was really funny. I look like Ringo Starr. I'm not kidding you. I look like Ringo Starr when I was that age. Couldn't play the drums, of course, but so so anyway, purity culture came later. It came with, I think there was when Jerry Falwell first started the Moral Majority, that also started a bunch of other things. They brought in the Southern Baptist approach to human sexuality. And I could see growing up, I was 30 years old in 1980, but starting about 1980, I started seeing the purity culture, the elements of it. In fact, and it's related to Patrick Carnes' bullshit book about sex addiction that was published in 1982 or 3, I don't remember. Mm-hmm. But, here's a guy talking about sex addiction, and here's the Baptist saying that if you have sex before marriage, you ruined your marriage. And, oh, by the way, you probably shouldn't be masturbating either. All these things start happening in the mid 80s. And by the 90s, we're having purity balls, with fathers putting rings on their daughters. Now that is fucking, that is weird. Fathers putting rings on their daughters.
It's amazing how normalized it is inside of those societies. I know myself and probably a lot of people listening are remembering I remember that. And it felt, if not normal, it was, we were supposed to believe that it was. And I think, I know I bought in.
Well, in some ways it was normal, quote unquote, in 1885 or 1812, but it was not normal after World War II. Especially with the invention of the pill and free love movement in the 60s. It was anything but normal. It was like there was a reaction to that in the late 70s on into the early 80s. And that's when I really saw purity culture starting. Now, of course, a lot of people are perpetuating and I mean, Josh, what's his name? Josh Harris.
Joshua Harris, yeah.
Yeah, wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Well, he wrote that book like in 1999 or something. So it's a lot later than the 80s. But by that time, it had really taken hold, especially in the evangelical movement, the Baptists, all the fundamentalist groups, because it's a patriarchal notion that the father owns the daughter, and until the daughter is, quote, given away to her future husband, he still owns her. And oh, by the way, if she should do anything, it reflects on him. So it brings in the notion of male shame, that the father is shamed for the daughter's inappropriate, I'm going to quote, inappropriate sexual behavior before she's married. And of course,
for our podcast audience, I'm doing air quotes and rolling my eyes as hard as I possibly can.
Right, exactly. So ultimately, it's just a patriarchal notion, because once she gets married, then she's got a ring on her finger again from her husband. It's a fucked up way to look at people as autonomous. We're autonomous creatures within a cultural framework, but some of that culture, and all cultures, take some of our autonomy away from us. You can't avoid it.
It's a trade-off being in a society, sure.
Right, but some cultures take it way far until there is no autonomy, and that's what purity culture was, an attempt to take back some autonomy that people had been given or found in the late 50s through the 60s and early 70s. So it's a back and forth within the culture. But I don't think it would have been possible without Jerry Falwell and the moral majority and some of that political movement that started. I know this isn't a political podcast, but politics do play a role.
Of course. Yeah.
And they started pushing notions of don't let schools teach sex education. And that was a Jerry Falwell. That was a Pat Robertson. Those fundamentalist groups were ranting and railing against secular sex education in the schools. And they began intimidating teachers and intimidating school boards, and then also getting elected to school boards so that sex education wouldn't be put in the school boards, which then allowed them to, actually start infiltrating the schools, because, love, what's the love?
True Love Waits?
True Love Waits was actually taught in schools. And now it's not, quote, religious, supposedly, but it was religious. It was religiously inspired. And it's a school board with members that are from fundamentalist congregations that are approving that education. So the purity movement, you cannot separate the purity movement from the political environment that came out of the early 70s, and specifically the Reagan administration. Because Nancy Reagan she was all about just say no, just say no to drugs, just say no to sex. Don't get your advice from Nancy Reagan. I'm just saying.
Well, yeah, you're talking about Jerry Falwell and Patrick Carnes. I have to imagine that in addition to just sort of the pushback against the free love of the 60s and the widespread use of the pill and these things, that the AIDS crisis had to be a pretty meaningful motivator in, I guess, getting these ideas out there and finding a connection with people.
Yeah, the whole narrative around AIDS is the gay disease, and it's a judgment from God. This was being preached from the pulpits of every fundamentalist church, and some that weren't so fundamentalist, by the way. So that's actually a political message. It's a political message about whether LGBTQ people belong in our society, or whether we should allow them to be the human beings that they want to be within our society. It wasn't just about sex, but it was a great way for them to propagandize us based on disease. And if you think about it, going back for centuries, disease has always been the label of those who are in the out group, whether it was the Jews or the gypsies or the immigrants from Italy. It doesn't matter. Disease was the excuse for othering them, for putting them down, for making them second-class citizens. And it goes way back. It goes even into prehistory, or not prehistory, but into early ancient history. You can see disease as a reason for excluding people, whether it was perceived or real. The leper, the whole notion of lepers.
Oh yeah, I mean that's something that came up in our most recent political cycle is we're talking about immigration and these different things. And
Right.
yeah, it's definitely a way of demonizing folks.
Right.
But I want to return to something you mentioned, true love waits. And I honestly missed out, if I can use that term, on that particular experience. So I'd love to get just a deeper understanding of what that program actually means and what you see as sort of the impact on the way we view sex as a culture.
It is. And true love waits includes some rather insidious messages, which would include self-pleasure, masturbation. Basically the approach says that sex is God-given and only people who are actually married under the aegis of their God are allowed to have sex. So by definition, any sex that's outside of this framework is illegal, illegitimate sex, and it's not blessed by God. So to masturbate means you are having sex outside of God's plan, quote plan. To have sex with your partner, whether they're, no matter if it's heterosex or gay sex or whatever sex you want, is still outside of God's plan if you don't have a ring on your finger, if you aren't owned by another person. And the ownership actually goes both ways, because Christians look at the married couple as owning each other, and Paul even talks about in the New Testament about you should please each other, and that's where the notion that you should have sex whether you want it or not because your partner wants it. There's no such thing as marital rape in the Bible. Yeah, that's true too.
I don't like to think about that overly much.
I don't know if that hits where you were looking to go, but that's the theology behind it, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I mean, this is an educational program that's being taught in schools and churches and things along those lines.
Yep, there's a whole curriculum around it, and they break out in small groups, and they have small group people talking to each other. Usually, a bunch of girls over here and a bunch of guys over here, and they're confessing that they've got, we have 15, 16-year-old kids going through this. And they've heard about sex addiction, and they've been told that you shouldn't masturbate or you shouldn't look at porn. And they're confessing to each other that I'm a porn addict or I'm a sex addict at 14 or 15. Well, I'll tell you, I've been a sex addict since I was 12 by that definition.
Sure.
I still am a sex addict at 70. So get over it. Enjoy yourself.
Yeah, I'll have to pull up the old episode we did where you, I, and the rest of the crew all took a sex addiction survey because I wasn't surprised that you and I scored really, really highly. I was a little embarrassed that nobody else on the crew scored in the sex addiction range. If you're curious about that, I'll just give you the quick notes and say sex addiction is not a thing. You're fine. Yeah. Anyway, I heard you name check Joshua Harris a moment ago, and I know I grew up reading I Kiss Dating Goodbye, and I know myself and a lot of the folks that are watching tonight, have seen firsthand what the impact of some of those ideas were. I know that whether they came straight from Joshua Harris in that book or not, I work with a lot of men in my counseling practice in their 20s and 30s that are still kind of stuck in this notion of courtship and see dating as exclusively being on like an escalator towards, marriage. And I'm curious from the outside, just sort of watching that come out and become as popular as it did, what you can tell us about the impact of these ideas.
Well, I've seen massive amounts of impact. I think men and women, it's on both sides, are in many cases traumatized, but certainly, if not traumatized, brainwashed or indoctrinated into a rather bizarre view of sex and sexuality that prevents them. I mean, I don't know how many people have come to me, or we see this on Recovering from Religion. As you know, I'm the president and founder of that. In recovery from religion, we see people coming to us virtually every day saying something along the lines of, I waited. True love did wait. And I waited till I was married, and we had the most miserable sex life. I've had people say we didn't even have sex for the first 6 months of our marriage because we're too embarrassed, or we're too shamed, or, or something like that. I see this so much. So what they're getting is a message of condemnation and shame and judgment when they're still single, and when they get married, suddenly they can't turn that off, and they are now stuck with a sexual framework that prohibits them from enjoying their own body or enjoying the other person's body. It's insidious because it's hard to get out of that sometimes, as you know, and that's why people need to visit people like you. And I would say me, but I don't practice anymore. So people like you, it's an insidious message that undermines marital happiness. No matter what you do in your life, I think a lot of people discovered after this true love waits hits them and they realized, oh, this is bullshit, that they needed a lot more sexual experience before they made a commitment to a spouse. And I hear that a lot. I wish I hadn't bought into that. I wish I'd have gone out and experienced other people's bodies, other people's minds before I committed to the person I did commit to. And almost all the time they say, I have a perfectly good spouse. My husband or wife, my partner is wonderful and great. We're just terribly incompatible when it comes to sex. And I wouldn't have made that commitment if I'd have known that.
Aren't just something that, a small group of people obsessed over. And we're not like examining some obscure book that was popular in the 90s. We're talking about something that's incredibly prevalent and that, definitely touched my life and is honestly probably part of why I got into this line of work. I had so much to learn and so much to unlearn.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I could throw this in. We talked about it before we get into calls and stuff. I just like to let people know I'm always happy to be on Secular Sexuality, but I'm really happy to be on tonight because this is the time for Recovering from Religion's big fundraiser. And we are in the middle, we're at the beginning of our fundraiser. And I just wanted to talk. It'd be okay to say a little bit about that before we move on?
Yeah, please do. And I'll go ahead and mention that there is already a link in the show notes to this episode for everything Darrel's talking about. If you're listening to this, you have access to all of that information. But tell us about it. Walk us through a little bit what y'all's goals are.
Well, everything we do, we give away. We provide for free. If somebody wants to call us, the call is free. If somebody wants to chat with us, the chat's free. If somebody wants to join our community, it's free. If somebody comes one of our support groups, it's free. All of our resources are free. Everything we do is free. With even a Secular is therapy project, the system is free, although the therapy itself costs money. We don't provide that. That's somebody else. But the fact is, it costs money to provide all this free service. And we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 volunteers that are providing that service. And that's how we can do it. We couldn't do it without the volunteers, but the technology costs money. Some of the travel we have to do costs money. There's resources. Some of the resources cost money. There's being online costs money. There's a lot of things that cost money. So we have to raise funds to make all this free stuff happen. And I'm here tonight to say Recover from Religion's having our fundraiser. The Friendly Neighborhood Atheist, Ethan Michaels, has been generous in offering to make this his thing. He's in his 1-year anniversary of a podcast, and he's making it a fundraiser for us. So we are delighted, and we really thank Ethan for doing that. So anyway, we'd just like you to get online. If you got a few bucks, throw them our way. If you don't mind, we'd really like people to donate monthly, even if it's a small amount. That helps us budget what we're going to do. But above all, find out who we are. And if you're interested in contributing and you don't have any money, that's fine. Come volunteer for us. We're always looking for volunteers, and we're looking for people that want to help other people. You don't have to have any special qualifications. We will train you. and we have damn good training. And I'll guarantee that you will probably leave, or when you're finished with our training, you'll be able to use those skills, not just for recovery from religion, but you'll be able to use them with your own family, with your own neighborhood. You'll be able to use skills that you learned from us. Anyway, thanks for letting me throw that in there, Christy.
I want to just kind of echo what you said about the training program that y'all put on. I think that, folks listening at home might think, okay, well, if they're not paid, like what can recovering from religion really offer me? What do these folks really know? It is actually really rigorous. I went through that training. I spent 3 years working as a suicide phone call operator. And the skills that I learned at that job lined up perfectly with everything that I learned in y'all's training. It was actually amazing to see a lot of the same ideas presented in a lot of the same ways. It was really intensive, and it's a really wonderful community of hardworking folks.
It is, and they're very hardworking. We've got a lot of people doing it. But thanks for telling me that. I don't think I'd ever heard that your comparison of that training, and it may even be more. We've added a few things to it probably since you went through.
Sure.
We're always improving it.
I went through right before the pandemic, and then decided I gotta shift my time usage a little bit here. But great work that y'all are doing, and the fundraiser that Ethan is putting together has a really impressive cast list. So if you haven't seen at least the promo, I really encourage folks to check out the link in the description of this episode and give it a look.
Great, good.